everyone. Welcome to Western Wildlife Corridor's online event, Fungi with Dr. Jim Chatfield. Dr. Jim Chatfield, it's good to see you guys here tonight. I wish I could actually see you. That would be really lovely. I'm definitely missing seeing everyone. My name is Ariana Lambert. I'm the staff member at Western Wildlife Corridor. Just a few things before we get started. I'm going to do a brief introduction on Western Wildlife Corridor, and then our main speaker is going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to go through some questions, but we can ask questions throughout as well. So feel free to put those in the chat. Mine is at the bottom of my screen and I can type in a chat, but some people might be at the top of their screen. It depends on where you put it. Oh, thank you, Lynette. That was very nice of you. Debate 9 o'clock. So we do encourage you to type those questions. We definitely want to know them. So as you come on, make sure you guys mute your audio, put your audio on mute, turn your cameras off. I'll help throughout that, but that's just to help the video run a little bit smoother. So yeah. So Western Wildlife Corridor, we're a mostly volunteer nonprofit organization. They've been running since 1992. I'm the only staff, so everyone else is amazing volunteers. We've been protecting land through ownership and setting up conservation easements. Our volunteers then go out and restore the preserves by clearing invasive species like Amur honeysuckle and garlic mustard. We do have several preserves, 4 of which are actually accessible to you guys and have trails that you guys can take throughout the pandemic. So if you guys are locked up and you're so done, you guys can go ahead and walk some of those trails. We do have our information on the screen this time so you guys can see. So check out our website. Our website team's been working really hard on that. But without further ado, today we're going to learn about fungi. We're so excited. We have Dr. Jim Chatfield here, who's kindly offered to talk for us. He's an associate professor at Ohio State University with the Department of Plant Pathology and in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science. He's taught various classes from woodland fungi to sustainable landscape and maintenance and diseases of ornamentals, which is pretty cool. He focuses on plant problem diagnostics, benefits of trees, proper tree selection, and management of ornamental plants as well. So Jim, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you should be able to take that over.
All right. Thanks, Ariana. As it turns out, I'm not a doctor, actually.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's Jim Chatfield. Let's see. What happened to my share screen option? All right. It was there earlier. What's that's all about?
Is it not there anymore?
Yeah.
Let me see what I can do.
Okay, I'm joining in here.
So that's a problem. If I can't share the screen, I'm not that interesting just to listen to.
I know. Let's see if I can put, well, no, I'm sure you're really interesting to listen to, but let's see if I can put that back and maybe it'll. Is that option available now?
Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay.
This will stop other screen sharing, but I guess that's okay. And let's see, so PowerPoint is our mode here today.
Just remember
it is opening, all right. So then we go to here and we should be started. Okay, I hope you see Tales of the Kingdom Fungi. Is that what you see now?
Yes, that is what we
Okay. All right, so our little cover story here, we may want to discuss this just a little bit. By the way, I was down in your area, a little bit to the east of the Western Wildlife Corridor, over in the Arc of Appalachia on Saturday and Sunday, and really a lot of neat nature preserves over that way too. So you're in a wonderful area of the state. I mean, I'm up in Northeast Ohio, that's where I live. And we got to see Davis Memorial, where you see this big fault that was really good for my wife, who's a geologist. And we saw the interesting plant Solivantia, which was growing along wet cliff sides, and really a beautiful park. So nice to be down in your part of the the area. You're down south this weekend. So we see some morels up here. We see here a couple of different fungi. Now, one of the things I wanted to do today, and I know that one of your main ways that you probably all think about the kingdom fungi is with woodland fungi, fleshy woodland fungi that you see on your walks, and in some cases, for some of you, you may eat some of those. But I also really want to talk about, put this into context of what fungi are, all the different things that we do. So plant pathology is an interest for me. And so we'll kind of weave all of that together with some different stories or tales of the kingdom fungi. So if we look over here to the left, you know, we have cedar apple rust. So this is this incredibly interesting disease. You know, here we have an eastern red cedar, which is the cedar part of the cedar apple rust name. So the fungus goes between the eastern red cedar or junipers, Juniperus virginiani, and a couple of other juniper species, goes back and forth between junipers, eastern red cedar, and plants in the rose family, such as crab apples and apples, hawthorns. You know, a very unusual scenario, really, if you think about host ranges of fungi. So fungi, you know, when we talk about plant pathology, we talk about host ranges, the different plants that are host for a particular infectious disease to occur. And when you really come down to it, usually host ranges are narrow. So even the powdery mildew fungi that were very common, we see on our turf grass and on our lilacs and roses and zinnias, all those powdery mildew fungi, for example, are different. They're physiologically specialized. And so the one that gets on lilac will not get on zinnia. They are specialized for their particular kinds of host. So typically host ranges extend to a species, sometimes to a genus, sometimes all the way up to a family. So a genus being a group of related species, a family being a group of related genuses or a genera. So it's really, you know, kind of fascinating that in this case, you go all the way to junipers, which are gymnosperms, naked seeds, things like pines, but in this case, junipers, all the way to plants that are angiosperms, the true flowering plants. So in a way, but only to angiosperms in the rose family, the Rosaceae, and only on certain species of juniper in the gymnosperm. So very broad host ranges in a way because they have alternate hosts, but very narrow host ranges as well. So a very fascinating kind of disease. And the reason that I have, so this is what you see on the juniper with the little gall, the abnormal growth occurring, which is part fungal tissue, part juniper tissue. And then it has these jelly-like teleal horns that occur in the springtime as these spores ooze out about a year and a half after the initial infection. And then these spores microscopically arrive over on the rosaceous host. And then they cause a symptom on the upper portion of the plant. And then the fungus mates inside the leaf. So another, you know, fascinating stuff. And it comes out the bottom of the leaf and as a different fungus, really, in a sense, because now it's mated. So there's two sets of chromosomes that came together. So a very fascinating kind of scenario. And then the spores go back to the juniper. So it's a cycle thing, and it's an obligate cycle that is occurring. So the reason I put it up here, though, right here, in addition to being one of the things that's kind of fascinating about the world of fungi, this is a new disease that we have. We think of cedar apple rust. We also have some other cedar rust, but this is a new one. This is a Asian red rust, which is now occurring. We're finding in the last couple of years in Ohio, only been found in 3 states in the United States. So another invasive species, in this case, an invasive fungus that we're just starting to learn about. Even during the pandemic, we were able to get some DNA analysis to make sure that we had this new fungus. And so we'll talk about it just a little bit. Now, over here, of course, we have one of my buddies, Eric Draper. And here he is with Calvatia gigantea, the giant puffball. Giant puffballs are not the best eating, but they are edible. It's kind of, you know, they're a good substrate for garlic and olive oil and whatnot. So they don't really have a fantastic, but they can provide a lot of fungi for a meal. if you get them early enough. But you, as we know, you know, the old saying, there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. Because the reality of it is that you have to be very careful with what you decide to eat. So there are actually species of puffballs. The pigskin puffball, the poison pigskin puffball has a good name because it is poisonous. And so one of the things to always recognize if you're going to decide that you're going to eat fungi is that, number one, we know that there are some fungi that are clearly poisonous to kind of everybody. The other thing that sometimes people don't know is that some of the edibles and even some of the choice edibles can cause quite a bit of gastric distress depending upon the particular Homo sapiens that's eating them. So it really depends on your own physiology as well. So even sometimes when there are, you know, fungi that many people do well with, other people may not. So you always have to be very careful. So this little fruiting body, and that's what a mushroom is, that's the fruiting body of a fungus, most of which the fungus is living as of strands underneath the soil in this case, or they may be in a tree or on your lettuce or whatever. But the fact is that the fruiting body, the reproductive structure of the fungus is what we see here, the fleshy part of this fungus. There are estimated to be 13 trillion, think of that for a minute, 13 trillion spores inside this basidiocarp, inside this fruiting body of the giant puffball, Calvacia gigantea, OSU extension in Geauga County. Now, I wonder if anybody knows who this guy is and what's going on with his crown of not thorns, but his crown of shoestrings. So this is your OSU extension agent Ag Natural Resource agent in Hamilton County, Buggy Joe Boggs. So he's an entomologist, great guy. And here he is at Clifton Gorge, which is not too far away from you near Yellow Springs. And we have crowned him here with the shoestring fungus. The shoestring fungus we'll talk about today too. These are hardened strands together. So a hypha is a strand of the fungus, which is microscopic in size. Massed together, the hypha is called the mycelium. And in some fungi, those mycelia harden off into something we call rhizomorphs. And a rhizomorph would be root-like shape. And so those rhizomorphs are shown here for this fungus, which is Armillaria melea. So the Armillaria melea is the honey mushroom that you'll see frequently in woodlands, very common fungus. And it also, in addition to fan-shaped mycelia that you'll see mostly on dead or dying wood, but then you'll also see that harden off into these rhizomorphs, these shoestrings. So we call it the shoestring fungus. And here Joe is just being a good model for that. So a couple of people showing off the mushrooms with them. These are asexual structures. These are the sexual structures, the fruiting bodies, two sets of chromosomes coming together and producing this mushroom. Now this one, I'm wondering how many of you have seen this. You probably have seen it if you have beech woods. Now you don't have as many beech woods down your area as we do up in Northeast Ohio, but this is a really interesting situation, and we'll take a look at this later. But this is Scoria spongiosa. And this is a fascinating thing too, because here you have a pathogen. Here you have something that is a saprophyte, so a pathogen causing infections of living cells, in this case of plants. Here you have a saprophyte living on dead organic matter, so it's not causing an infection or infectious disease or a host parasite relationship. Here you have something that's a little different. And what you have here, actually it's a saprophyte, but what you have here is a fungus that's living on aphid poop. So we call this the beech aphid poop eater fungus. And so there's an aphid that exists on beech trees. And this aphid is sucking sap from plants. It excretes the sap after utilizing some of the ingredients of the sap for its own nutrition for this aphid. And we call it the boogie woogie aphid, because if you come upon these aphids, they're white and they gyrate in boogie woogie like, and in mass to try to scare off predators. And so the insects suck sap out of the plant, and then they excrete slightly modified sap out the other end. And that sap is called honeydew, because we're very polite in our area of of biology. And so that honeydew then becomes colonized by Scoria spongiosa. And so basically this fungus here is living on the aphid poop, or the aphid pea, if you would like, that's coming out from that infestation of the aphid. So, there's really are a lot of really unusual scenarios. Okay, so first of all, what could be more beautiful? Again, this is a juniper, eastern red cedar. This is a gall composed of juniper tissue and tissue of Gymnosporangium juniperi virginianae. So a great Latin binomial. The juniper virginia. So Gymnosporangium is the genus of the fungus. And of course, the specific epithet, Juniperi virginianae, indicates its relationship on this eastern red cedar. And these spores, millions of these will come out, these cedar apples, sometimes people call them, but they're these galls. These millions of spores are going to be flying over to the rosaceous host. And they could also, it could be used as a nice corsage for a sharp-dressed man. The only time I've ever been called a sharp-dressed man. All right, so if you went to Crablandia, which is our crabapple, it is the premier crabapple evaluation plot for the International Ornamental Crabapple Society that we have at Sechrist Arboretum. You're welcome to come dawn to dusk every day of the year up in Worcester, Ohio, Northeast Ohio. And this is just some of our trial plots that we have up here. We have a really nice drone that we did this last spring. We did the drone the day before our May 6 hard 26-degree frost. So it's kind of a good time to get it done. All right, so here we have in Nature's Infinite Book of Secrecy, a little I can read, one of my favorite quotes from Shakespeare, and one that really relates to all of you, because as you know, there are no know-it-alls in the Western Wildlife Corridor. Nobody can really come anywhere close to knowing 1% of all there is to know about wildlife and plant life and animal life in anywhere in the world. So it's wonderful that you continuously learn new stuff. And the reason I bring this up early on here is something new, and that is these cedar rust. There are a number of different ones. There's actually dozens of species of rust fungi that do this thing between cedars, this eastern red cedar, juniper, and the rosaceous host. There's cedar apple rust, Gymnosporangium juniperi virginianae, cedar hawthorn rust, Gymnosporangium globosum, cedar quince rust. This usually occurs on the fruits of crab apples and hawthorns. And we call that Gymnosporangium clavipes. But interestingly enough, and so you have here, again, another picture here. This is what it usually looks like, is this very orange look. This happens to be on a hawthorn leaf. So it looks very orange. The symptoms are kind of orange on the upper surface of the leaf. Then it comes out the bottom, and those spores, which are now different because they are two strains of the fungus have come together inside that leaf, and they will not reinfect. There is no repeating cycle on that host plant. They'll only go back to the junipers over a 3 or 4 month period, and then a year and a half later, you'll have this again. And so, the cycle is important if you're going to think, for example, of how to control that if you're an apple orchardist. The reason I bring it up here, and I added this just last night, is we now have another species. You saw I had those 3 species. Gymnosporangium yamadae, though, is a new rust fungus, which we have some significant concerns of. We started to see a bunch of our crab apples at Sechrist Arboretum having rust symptoms last year that we'd never seen on them before. And in fact, we have 76 different types of crab apples in a replicated randomized plot in Worcester, Ohio. And until last year, we had maybe 3 or 4 of the different types of crab apples, different genetics, that had rust. And as of last year, we had all but 3 of them. And this year, every single one of them has rust. And so we were a little bit, what's going on? What has happened now? We know that there's plenty of junipers in our plots, near our plots, our crab apple plots. So we have plenty of inoculum. There wasn't anything, incredibly dramatic about the season last year. And we also noticed that, boy, instead of it being all this orange, it really is more this red coloration. So this red coloration. And so then, as I say, this summer, we collected a bunch of these samples, sent them to took them down to Francesca Peduto-Hand, who's our ornamental plant pathologist at Ohio State. And so we have done DNA analysis, and it is this Yamadae, this Gymnospermgium Yamadae, and then you see the fungus coming out the bottom, which is going to go back to the juniper in this cycle. So there are new things that occur. It's fascinating to see this new problem that's occurring. And so that's kind of our introduction to our 10 tales of the kingdom fungi that we have today. So from parasites to poisons, to penicillium and pinots, the perfect picnic, the honey mushroom, and the aborted entoloma. A selected symbiosis, the beach blight aphid poop eater, dryad saddle, apple scab, and OARDC, pathogenesis, and an ode to rot, and the amazing cedar rust in the final fungal lineup. We'll see if we can get it all through, and we'll see. By the way, the structure of the penicillium fungus. So think about all these different kinds of usages or roles or types of modes of living that fungi have. Here we have the representation of the chemical structure of what we are able to take from the penicillium fungus, which we then, of course, have put to great use as an antibiotic. So let's just kind of, before we get into all that, look at some of these things. The oyster mushroom, I see we have a little bit of adjustment I needed to do with my rebooting of the program here, but Pleurotus is our fungus. So the beautiful, these were taken when I used to teach a fleshy woodland fungi class at the Ohio State. And you see the kind of rot that occurs. You see how beautiful the oyster fungus can be, and you can see how good they are. So in my class, we had a young man named Noah, and he was our chef for the day when we went out on one of our fungal forays, and quite wonderful oyster mushrooms. So Pleurotus austriatus, it's a shelf-like mushroom, deciduous trees. And one of the things is that even though these are living saprophytically, in which case the host parasite thing is a little different, still the fact is there is a host range aspect. So willow and aspen are especially good, but there are on other kinds of trees as well. Broad, fleshy white. So some of the ideas, the gray or brown cap. So you have to think about the different components of a fungal fruiting body, the whitish yellow tinged oaks. Where this is just where we had them that particular year. I mean, you know, fungi really just provides just such a wonderful, you know, you really can't believe. Many of you may have seen the movie Fantastic Fungi that just came out. And it's an interesting movie. I mean, it goes a little bit, I mean, I know the people that did it, and the photography is absolutely fantastic. I mean, it gets into the, you know, a little bit over the top in some ways. Fungi were going to save the world. And of course, there are a lot of bioremediation efforts with fungi. And of course, there are plenty of hallucinogenic mushrooms. And so the magic mushrooms were kind of a big part of the thing, and how that can affect consciousness and all that kind of thing. And so, you know, but it's a really fascinating, and just, it really reflects and gives us that sense of, as you can imagine from your forays and looking at what's in the woods, just how unbelievably incredible things really are. So the tree ear or wood ear fungus, Auricularia auricula, really does look like ears, no question about it. And they're pretty common that you're going to see these, and they can be pretty fantastic. The thick maize oak polypore. I mean, look at this. I mean, look at what you're seeing here with the maize. You know, and there you get the Didula from Digulus in the Greek mythology. But I mean, look at the incredible details that you can have on some of these fruiting bodies when you're looking. Just, you know, this anastomosing legs. It's just a wonderful, wonderful. Look at that. How fascinating it is to look at these up close, and of course, really wonderful for photography. The hexagonal pored polypore, and so you can see little hexagons for those pores. And so these are the pored mushrooms versus the ones that have gills. And so there's some considerations of what's in under that cap. Of course, where those are, those gills, and where these pores are, where the spores are going to be. So the massive numbers of spores that are there. So, you know, quite beautiful little structures up close and at large as well. So really wonderful things. One of the most common mushrooms that you're going to see, chicken of the woods. Sometimes this will be a little bit more yellowish and sulfurish color, as you can see from Letoporus sulphureus. You'll see this oftentimes on fallen logs in the woods. You'll also see it sometimes where there has been decay inside the plant. It's pretty much a saprophyte, not really occurring as a parasite, so living on dead organic matter. But really you can see here a little bit more yellow, very beautiful, very common. Oftentimes the orange and yellow are together, and so that's really quite an attractive kind of look to it as well. And you can see that how attractive that really is. And of course, they look different as they progress. Now that's different. Chicken of the woods, we're going to eventually see something different, but that's what it can look like after it is decayed a little bit. And by the way, how do fungi decay? They decay because of fungi and bacteria. And of course, insects get in there too, but there are fungi that infect fungi. One of many of you have probably heard, if you are an ornamental horticulturalist, of the verticillium fungus. So verticillium alboatrum, verticillium dahlia, which occurs all kinds of what are called vascular wilts on your landscape trees, Japanese maples, and your garden plants. I mean, when you talk about a VFN hybrid tomato, for example, the V is for verticillium. So they would be a tomato that has resistance genetically to verticillium. And that's what the V comes from. So that fungus is a real problematical plant pathogen. Guess what one of its main enemies is? Or guess what one of the main enemies of growing button mushrooms, just growing our common Agaricus bisporus mushroom? One of its most common enemies, the thing that causes big problems for mushroom producers, the verticillium fungus, which is a mycoparasite, a fungus affecting a fungus. Ganoderma lucidum, one of the most important from a folklore medicine thing in the world, Ling Chi, thought to be everything from something that can help with cancer remediation in ethnobotany to an aphrodisiac. This really quite beautiful looking fungus, Ganoderma lucidum, really glossy kind of look. You can see the kind of things. And here's one where you need to pay some attention. Probably, I don't know that I can say that I've ever saved anybody's life through my identification, but it is important to pay attention to detail here. So for example, the smooth chanterelle, Cantharellus lateritius, is something you'll see in the woodlands. And this is kind of the way it looks. It has, it's kind of this yellow-orange color and mostly pretty much scattered and reasonably small. So there's the way it looks. And that really kind of a nice orange-yellow color. The smooth chanterelle, really fantastic eating, the chanterelle mushrooms, used a lot in a culinary sense. But I want you to look here at what it looks like on the underside here. And look how these they're kind of obscure, kind of, not real defined areas where these gills are going to be occurring. There's another look at it, the kind of looks that it has. Another species of Cantharellus. And then you come to jack-o'-lantern. So here's the false chanterelles. So these false chanterelles, typically a little bit more orange, but this is where I have actually helped some people, even on the phone, calling up, I've got these mushrooms, I'm just getting ready to eat them. I really want to, I think they're chanterelles, but I'm just not sure. And one of the things that you have to look at, usually these colonies, as you can see, are different, but you can, sometimes it's not exactly as clear as that. And look at this. So you look on the undersurface of that cap and look at how the gills are just razor sharp. So you compare that to the true chanterelle. Notice that that isn't what it looks like on that underside. Even if you get some gradation between this yellow and the orange, I mean, it looks like they're really different, but people make this mistake frequently because sometimes the colors are not exactly what people expect, and there's different kinds of light and different kinds of maturity of the fruiting body, et cetera, et cetera. But notice how with the chanterelle, how, these are really not real well-defined little lines here of where those gills are lined up, where the spores are. And then with the jack-o'-lantern, which is also one of these wonderful mushrooms, it's going to glow in the dark and that sort of thing. But notice how delineated those layers of gills are. And so that is the jack-o'-lantern, which is quite toxic. The wrinkled peach. look at these. Look at these different kinds of fungi and just how beautiful they are. Look at that. I mean, isn't that something to come across? It's like, what a prize that you feel. The lion's mane fungus, many of you have seen this out in the woods. And they're just, you know, the really interesting look to these things. And you say, what kind of a creature do we have here? So there are all kinds of things. All right, so we kind of got ourselves warmed up a little bit more here. By the way, this is really a wonderful fungus. Now it's pretty small, so maybe a little bit more than a pencil eraser size. When I was first, there is an aspect of which some of you may have discovered, and that is the importance of meditation if you become a woodland fungi lover. And when I say that meditation, this is going to be especially if you live in Ohio. So it'd be a little different for you over in Kentucky or Indiana, but if you're in Ohio, you really must meditate. Om, om, om. And I say that because it is the Ohio Mushroom Society, OMS. Om. They're a wonderful group. So as I was getting ready to teach fleshy woodland fungi, when Lanny Rhodes retired at Ohio State, I went out on a foray with these people, and they're just wonderful. They have all this fascination and interest. And they kept talking about the eyelash fungus, the eyelash. And I'd say, you know, what are you talking about? It's small. I was looking, look at the little eyelashes. The eyelashes are so wonderful. They're fantastic. And I get down there, I'd look really close, and I say, I just don't see it. So between, however, the first foray I went with them as I was learning from them, and the second foray that I went on with them, I had cataract surgery. So after my cataract surgery, I could now see this very clearly. So, I mean, I really didn't realize that as I was, you know, moving into my early 60s, that the cataracts were, that's why I couldn't see the eyelashes. But if you do have eyes that can see it, these are really, really wonderful. I mean, these little eyelashes. This is a little thing called the walnut mycena. If you see a fungus that looks a little bit like this, these little tiny guys, and you not just, you know, when you're going along, and this would be good on your first date with somebody, your first date where you're out on a walk and you're trying to show how much you know, and you see a walnut tree, and then you see these little fungi, and he says, you know, I'll bet you those are attached to a buried walnut. And you will impress them almost every time. This is the walnut mycena, and it will be associated with that buried walnut. It's just, that's its host. All right, so what are fungi? Are they plants? They used to be considered plants when we just thought of the world, and you know, the world didn't change, we just thought of it differently. We used to say there were two kingdoms of life on earth, plants and animals. Then we, you know, so the idea was that fungi, you know, don't move around like an animal moves around, and they have cell walls, and that's what plants have. So it's, you know, so they put them in the plant kingdom. But then finally they said, well, now, wait a minute. There's, you know, as we think about classifying organisms, we went from a 2-kingdom system to a 5-kingdom system, you know, and that 5-kingdom system by the mid-50s solidified. You know, we didn't add 3 kingdoms, we just thought of it differently. And so we said, well, fungi are different because they don't do something which is so fundamentally plant-like. Plants make their own food. So he said, so they don't make their own food. They live on dead organic matter or living cells, but they don't make their own food through photosynthesis. So he said, so fungi is the 3rd kingdom. We then said, okay, bacteria are really weird because bacteria are single-celled. And not only are they single-celled, but they don't concentrate their genetic material in a nucleus. So, okay, we'll have a kingdom that we'll call bacteria, we'll call it Monera. So there were 4 kingdoms. And then they said, well, there's a bunch of other weird stuff that we'll call protists. So they have single cells or cells that aggregate together, but not really into organs or anything like that. But they have nuclei. So we'll call those things protists. So you had plants, animals, fungi, bacteria called Monera, and protists. And then eventually now we're kind of in a 29 kingdom system by a lot of taxonomists. So, you know, so the reality of it is the world, our understanding of the world changes. It's what science is actually all about. It's just trying to describe nature better than we did before. And so fungi are not considered plants anymore. They have nuclei. What does not? Bacteria. Fungi do not have chlorophyll. What does? Plants do. They possess chitinous cell walls. And then you say all fungi, well, there's where we went from 5 to 29. So for example, there are some things we used to call fungi, which I accidentally sometimes still call fungi, called the water mold. So the water molds like Pythium and Phytophthora, those are now considered to be in their own kingdom. It's their own Oomycotis kingdom because they have cellulose cell walls, cellulose cell walls instead of chitinous cell walls. So they're very different. And they also have different modes of reproduction. They also have different physiologies. They have different forms of motility. So they were kicked out of the fungal kingdom, even though we sometimes still call them fungi, but they're not. So they reproduce by spores. Most have filamentous asexual structures like that hyphae. On there you can see some hyphae there. And hyphae together make up mycelia. They have fruiting bodies, which can be sacs like ascomycetes. And the sacs would be things like this eyelash fungus, things like morels. And then you have the mushrooms that are considered in the Basidiomycetes. Now, sometimes people will call ascomycetes that are fleshy, like a morel, they'll call them mushrooms, but in a semi-technical way, mushrooms are reserved to the Basidiomycetes, the club fungi. And you have these little fruiting bodies. Here's the fruiting body of an apple scab fungus. And you can see this little flask-shaped organism and then little sexual spores that are developing inside. This is about the size of a tiny little pimple. So, and it causes apple scab disease. All right, so the fungal fruiting bodies can be these wonderful things. I mean, look at all the different looks. You've seen this as the chicken in the woods. You can see all these different kind of things. This verticillate branching that you're going to see, or the penicillate branching on Penicillium. This is a fun one here that you can see some lichens here, and we'll bring up lichens in a minute. And then you can see this fungus here, and you can see some algae growing here. So there's some algae, there's a fungus, there's a lichen, which has a fungal component to it, along with a blue-green alga. And if you could also have a moss. And so these are all different kinds and types of organisms. Mosses are plants. And then this one I just love because it almost looks like a macaroon. So it looks like a little French mushroom. So the many faces of fungi, from saprophytes to parasites, from soloists to partners. Sometimes they have real interesting symbioses. Some of them are considered beneficial. Some of them are considered harmful. Of course, that all is who is in the eye of the beholder. From rot to Roquefort, okay? So Penicillium roquefortii. So, I mean, think about it. Penicillium roquefortii is, the fungus that gives us our taste to Roquefort cheese. Penicillium camembertii, as you might imagine, is camembert. From toxins to intoxicants, composters, a key to decomposition, so many different things, foodstuffs, plant parasites, symbionts. Look at this, what you're looking at here is not Spanish moss, which it kind of looks like. Spanish moss is actually a flowering plant. It's actually a bromeliad. But this is actually, instead of being Spanish moss, this is a lichen, the old man's beard lichen that you'll see especially out west, and lichen being a combination of a fungus and a cyanobacterium. And then look at this little tree. This is called an arbuscule. So this is an arbuscular mycorrhiza. So mycorrhiza means fungus roots. Turns out that most of the roots, most of our plants have little fungus roots. So a fungus that is a symbiont with the plant, and in many cases is considered beneficial because it helps bring nutrients up into the plant and then takes from the plant carbohydrates because they're not able, again, to produce their own carbohydrates. And so this is a symbiosis. And look at what it looks like if you stain it, and this is microscopic. This is an arbuscule of a fungal root, a mycorrhiza. Fantastic stuff. So medicines, obviously penicillium. So we'll keep going on this. Now look at this. This is a great book. I really advise you to get this book. It's 1939 book, so it's not up to date, but it's written ironically by E.C. Large, talking about microscopic things mostly. The Advance of the Fungi. He began poking about amongst the remaining flora in the garden, looking for other forms of fungoid life, spots and molds and mildews which cause plant disease. He would cultivate a garden, but nonetheless a garden of plants. We don't consider them plants anymore, but minute parasitic plants. All these organisms suitably magnified were at least as beautiful in form and as interesting in function as their grosser and more familiar host. Advance of the Fungi, get it. look at these different things. I mean, this is, I mean, I'm Big Laughing Jim here with my little sedum, but this is a hallucinogenic fungus that we found up in the woods near where I live in Johnson Woods Nature Preserve up in Northeast Ohio. And quite a hallucinogen and a really interesting little bracket fungi that you see in that thing. Toxin producers. Aflatoxins come from Aspergillus flavus, aflatoxins. Now, these are toxins that are produced and we have in foodstuffs. Years ago, we had a big scare with peanut butter because the level of Aspergillus flavus aflatoxins was significant enough that it was considered to be a problem at a given point in time. There are aflatoxins in pretty much all the corn and so many of the plants that we have and a lot of them foodstuffs. The issue is what percentage. So when you have people taking corn, for example, with this aflatoxins and other fungal toxins, the percentage of moisture in the corn relates then to how many aflatoxins are going to be present and other fungal toxins, and then you're given a given amount of money for your load of corn based on that moisture content, because they may have to dilute it so that it gets down to a level that's not a problem. The dose makes the poison. We obviously know there are toxin producers with poisonous mushrooms. You've probably heard of the ergot alkaloids from Claviceps purpurea. And so that is, here we have gangrenous ergotism. So back in the Middle Ages and all the way up into the interwar periods in the 20th century between World War I and World War II, where people were starving and were using ergoted rye, you can get grains that are infected by this fungus that causes ergot, gangrenous ergotism. And in the old days when there wasn't really good control of the seed, we had much more of this. As these ergot sclerotia were milled into the grain, but also lysergic acid. So this is the source that they then developed LSD from this. And so the other thing that happened was St. Anthony's fire, people dancing around crazily because they were having hallucinations. So Claviceps purpurea, you would get the fungus kind of replacing most of the grain. That's the fungus fruiting on this ergoted grain. And you see that you don't want this many of these grains that are ergoted in with your other grain. And then you hear, of course, the issues, some people do believe by mapping out, there are people that have mapped out where the women who are accused of, the girls that were accused of being witches in Salem, they kind of mapped out where they lived, and it seemed to be in lower areas where there might have been a greater possibility of ergoted grain. And so perhaps they were acting kind of crazy, acting like they were on a trip, acting weirdly, witch-like. And so maybe that helped explain why they were being so unusual, because they were in areas where there would have been more ergoted grain. Animal and human pathogens, aspergillosis, candidosis, all these different kinds of things, sporodociosis. The athlete's foot fungus, this is just a joke. We do have a fungus that that causes athlete's foot. So there are human pathogens that are fungi. They don't look like this. So this is the part that's a joke. These are not, these little mushrooms are that, as you who do have athlete's foot realize, you don't have little mushrooms, but it is a fungus. Tinea is an ascomycete or sac fungus. So they're human pathogens, animal pathogens. Sporotrichosis is something a lot of people are unaware of. It is a fungus that exists on rose thorns and other things, but oftentimes on rose thorns. And so it's actually a soil-borne fungus, Sporothrix schinkii. And so, I told this once to a master gardener class, kind of was describing it and showing these kinds of symptoms that you had and saying, you got to make sure if you get stuck by a rose thorn that you're careful and go to the doctor if it really develops into these kind of blisters. And I was kind of saying it kind of like, isn't that weird? Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that interesting? And then a woman raised her hand and says, my brother died from this. So it can be very serious. So, another reason to go to the doctor. Very uncommon, but it is a hazard of horticulture because the fungus is not infecting the rose plant. It is just living on the rose plant. It's not a plant pathogen, but it is a human pathogen because it causes problems if it is in the rose thorn is critical in the sense that it's a good way to inoculate you. So there's really all kinds of things, medicine, Penicillium chrysogenum, the modified penicilliums, and all these other kinds of things, the Ling Chi folk medicine, Ganoderma fungus. So all kinds of things that fungi can be used as medicine. Bioremediation, white rot fungi are used for the digestion of coal tars and other pollutants. Armillaria solidipes, so that's a relative of the Armillaria mellia mushroom, the honey mushroom, is considered by many to be the largest organism on the earth. Some other people say that an aspen grove is bigger, but there's a colony of this fungus that's over 3.5 miles wide that's considered an individual organism over 9,000 years old. Now and I want to say his name is Nicholas Money. I should know his name. He's a really fantastic guy. He's written a bunch of interesting mushroom books out of the University of Miami, Ohio. And he has some wonderful YouTubes, and the Aprosoria that are the structures that penetrate leaves can have over 1,200 pounds per square inch of pressure when they penetrate. So, really a lot of fascinating thing. All right, the perfect picnic. A baguette. Well, you obviously, if you're going to be baking bread, you've got yeast in there that are fungi, some cheese, maybe let's have some Roquefort or some Camembert, let's say, some sauteed morels. You wash down with a dry Riesling or a good Pinot Noir as you're getting Saccharomyces cerevisiae. If you're having a beer, that could be your alternate here. But you're getting all these yeast that are crucial in fermentation, and finished it off by the food of the gods, Theobroma cacao. And you say, what do you mean Theobroma cacao? So it turns out that fungi are very important in Theobroma cacao, which is the Latin binomial for the cocoa plant. So it turns out that in 2 different ways, fungi are critical for our enjoyment of chocolate. First of all, they are very dependent on having mycorrhizal fungi relative to functioning nutritionally well. So they need fungi to be those fungus roots that help with nutrition in the tropics. Secondly, in order to take the bitter aspects inside those fruits of the cocoa plant, you need some fungi that digest that. So, cacao beans are very bitter. Candida crucei and geotrichum decompose the seeds, produce acetic acid, killing the embryo, destroying bitter compounds, creating heavenly aromas. And then, of course, here's our mycorrhizal fungi, the vesicles, along with the arbuscules that occur inside plants. What other fungus is critical? That's the mycorrhizal fungi. So that picnic, the baguette, the cheese, the wine, the beer, the chocolate, dependent on fungi. The honey mushroom, there's the honey mushroom. Looks like tiny little, it's 7:49, I gotta hurry. The honey mushroom there, it looks like little pancakes, Armillaria mellia. Look at its different forms. There are those shoestrings though. Those are the hardened strands of the fungus. So the fruiting bodies, the reproductive structures here, the asexual hardened mycelia that are here, that are those shoestrings, are the 2 different things. And then let's bring in the aborted entoloma. What in heaven's name can I be talking about here? So this is Entoloma abortivum, and this is an uninfected fruiting body of Entoloma abortiva. Okay, but there's the aborted entoloma. What are we talking about here? What's happened here? You'll see this in the woods all the time. Oh, what's happened to these powdered sugar donuts that have been left out in the woods? What is going on? Well, here's the deal. And when I first taught Fleshy Woodland Fungi, we brought in Britt Bunyard, who is the editor of Fungi Magazine, Dr. Britt Bunyard, fantastic guy. So he was teaching us this. And so as it turns out that entoloma becomes infected by armillaria, or it's vice versa. There's a difference of opinion. Mostly people think it's the armillaria that is itself being parasitized by entoloma. But here's an interesting thing that occurs. So 2 fungi that have some sort of relationship between the 2 of them. And so here's some fresh specimens, and there's a point I want to make a minute. This is what you'll see, and you've seen this. I'm telling you, you've seen this in the woods. Little patches of it, very, very common. And I guess I don't have that next picture. But here's the deal. If you would try to eat Entoloma abortivum that has not been infected or is infecting armillaria and the shoestring, if you tried to eat that, it wouldn't kill you, but it would probably cause digestive upset. You have some digestive upset associated with it, unless they are infecting each other. Something happens in the process of those two fungi infecting each other that makes it very palatable. So I had a picture of us eating it. And, we believed Britt because, he was an expert, and it turns out that they were delicious and everybody was fine with it. So it is really, so what a fantastic physiological thing that's going on in that situation. A selected symbiosis. Symbiosis is a close and often long-term interaction between two or more different biological species. Some people always think of symbiosis as being positive, but in the usual term used scientifically, there are different types of symbiosis. Mutualistic, so a mutualistic symbiosis is when both partners appear to benefit. Those would be lichens, mycorrhizae that we talked about, endophytic fungi on turf grasses. Commensalism would be the sooty mold fungus, which is that fungus that we saw on the beach, where you have one that has benefited, the other one doesn't really matter. Parasitism, in which one of the partners is benefited, one is not benefited, verticillium fungus on tomato. And amensalism, when you have a positive and something that isn't really actual biological, and that is juglone. So for example, that really is a different kind of situation. Juglone is a chemical produced by walnuts that hurt tomato plants and other kinds of plants. So there's all these different kinds of symbioses. But lichens, mycorrhizae, and endophytic fungi and turfgrass are mutualistic symbioses, and we won't talk about this. The final exam will be to name a tripartite mutualistic symbiosis. I don't know if we'll get to that or not, but if you ask it, if it sticks in your mind and you want some help on your PhD examination someday down the road in biology, ask this in the questions at the end and we'll talk about it. But these are examples. We won't talk about the turfgrass. Fungus met alga. Lichens are wonderful dual organisms found on trees and other substrates, although there's a little coda to this. It's 3 organisms instead, but we'll talk about that. But they're really fantastic. So what lichens are not? So lichens are not mosses. Lichens are, there's a moss. Lichens are not lichens. And I have to admit that when somebody told me, hey, there's a movie about lichens. I said, a movie about lichens? You gotta be kidding me, fantastic. Kate Beckinsale's in it, it's a big movie. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. It turns out it was lichen, so, wolf-like creatures. And then one time I went to the dermatologist. And so I saw this thing on the wall, lichen planus. And I thought, lichen planus, it occurs on people, it kind of looks like, but no, it's just a term that is used. Lichen, it's not the lichen that we're talking about, this symbiosis. But look at lichens. And this is a great book, Lichens of North America. It's like a 1,000-page book. It's incredible. But the pictures in it are really fantastic. But then these are pictures, just my pictures. They are a composite of a fungus and an organism capable of producing food by photosynthesis. So there's the key. The fungus can't produce food. That's why it's not considered a plant. So you have another organism in the symbiosis that can. But look at the kinds of these are lichens just on the stem of a ginkgo plant. These little wonderful, there's the British soldiers. So these are all lichens. So these really wonderful symbiosis. Thoreau, I find myself inspecting little granules, as it were, on the bark of trees, little shields or apothecia, fruiting body, springing from a thallus of asexual structure, such as the mood of my mind, and I call it studying. So, Thoreau was talking about this. I love this because there's lichens here, and then look at this little creature here. This is a frog or toad, and it's called, it has the pattern. Look at its pattern, this little mimicry that exists with that. So lichens are a member of the Ascomycete, the cup fungi, or in the kingdom fungi, and a green alga in the kingdom Protocista, or most commonly a cyanobacterium. So that's a little bit of a reclassification, formerly known as blue-green algae. And the key thing is that they are able to photosynthesize. The apothecia, of which Thoreau speaks, are a type of cup-like fruiting body. The thallus, a vegetative body consisting of both algal and fungal components. So, in the pre-1860s, lichens were considered plants. 1868, lichens are considered sac fungi that enslave algae, farming algae, kind of a neat way to think of it. Lichens soon seen as a mutualistic symbiosis between the two. They both benefited. The substrate, the fungus created the substrate, the lichen, the alga then produced the food, and so they were helping each other out. But now look at this, 2016, 4 years ago, they realized that there's another fungus inside the symbiosis. So we knew about the sac fungus, we knew about the cyanobacteria. We discovered what happened is a guy kept finding all these club fungi, these basidiomycetes that were in this in all these cultures. And so at first he figured, okay, well, somehow the cultures have been contaminated. Something has happened and they've become contaminated. But he kept looking at samples from all over the world, and they soon realized that there is a second fungus, a sac fungus and a basidiomycete, a club fungus. You might say, well, who cares? Well, the reason that it can be important is that what are they doing? What are they doing? Can they be useful in understanding what they're doing with bioremediation and stuff like this? Biology textbooks tell us that lichens are alliances between organisms, a fungus and an alga. They are wrong, but really we don't know what they do yet. And so this is emerging science. It's wonderful. Now here's a kind of neat thing, some of the names of lichen: rock pimples, earth wrinkles, angel's hair, freckle pelts, fog fingers, dragon's funnel, tar jelly, old man's beard, powder tipped antler lichen, elf ear lichen, 5 o'clock shadow lichen, hairball lichen, naked kidney lichen, on and on, candy lichen. This was interesting because I got these terms from Audubon's field guide, which is the field guide I used for the class when I started teaching fleshy woodland fungi. And so I was saying, my God, these common names, not the Latin binomials, the common names are just incredible. And so I read the preface to the book and it said, well, many lichens don't have common names, so we made them up. So it was somebody that was just very creatively making up these common names. Now you can't just make up the Latin binomials. There has to be some relationship to other organisms that have been identified. But they just basically admitted, well, we just made them up. If there isn't something that anybody's called dragon's funnel until we decided to call it that. So that was kind of funny. But look how beautiful they really are. Look how wonderful things, found at elevations above 23,000 feet, found 250 miles from the South Pole, survive unprotected in space in a particular experiment. Really a fantastic thing. Over 90% of winter caribou diet, there was a concern with Chernobyl, are lichens, lichen glades due to allelopathy near timberlines. So they're using allelopathy like the walnut uses the juglone to keep other organisms away. That's the idea behind allelopathy. And it's just fantastic. Old man's beard used in herbal medicine conundrum. And the conundrum is that they can be very toxic with people with certain kinds of liver conditions. So always something to keep in mind, the mycorrhizae, the example of a mutualistic symbiosis relationship. So which of the following is an example? This just kind of relates to the different things that are going on in nature. An example of a mutualistic symbiosis relationship between a fungus and plant roots, mycorrhizae, fungus roots. Rhizobium nodulations on plants in the Fabaceae? No, that's not, because rhizobium is a bacterium. This is why in green manures, we always like to have a bean in there, an alfalfa or a clover or a soybean. Phytophthora cinnamomi on taxus roots, well, that's a pathogen. Phytophthora cinnamomi is a pathogen. It's also now no longer considered a fungus. It's been moved to the Mycota. And allelopathy of black walnuts to tomatoes. No, that's not a mutualistic symbiosis because that's just one organism. These are two different organisms, but they're not two different organisms that are infecting, one affecting another. It's that commensalism. So there is a vesicular arbuscular, used to be the name, it's now just called arbuscular. There's the vesicles of this kind of mycorrhizae. If you stain them, this is exactly like what I had them in my master's thesis. And then here is ectomycorrhizae, which are more this fungal mantle that occurs out there. And a lot of our mushrooms in the woods are ectomycorrhizae, helpful in nutrition. And so a lot of things occur. And one of the things we always have to understand about nature, here's parasites, gains nutrients from alive organisms. Mutualist gains nutrients from host, but gives something back here. And then you have also saprophytes, just living on dead organisms. This can shift. This can actually shift depending upon the situation. So sometimes something that is a mutualist can become a parasite. That really happens with the fungus Rhizoctonia and orchids. But look at the arbuscules, the little trees. If you stain them properly, you'll see this on the roots. It's just a wonderful thing. And you can see why they're called arbuscules. Now, here's an interesting question from a horticultural point of view. And I understand you're more nature instead of nurture, although we're all nature-nurture kind of combinations. This is important. There is no question that mycorrhizal fungi play an extremely important role in the life of nearly every terrestrial plant we encounter. We need to be realistic, however, about what we can expect these products to do and when. So somebody said, well, boy, if they're necessary, let's make some products. I mean, what about if we're using, what about if we sterilize the soil and are killing off the natural mycorrhizal fungi? What about, all those kind of things? Maybe we'll add some mycorrhizal fungi, but we have discovered that we can't effectively do it. There's not enough inoculum in our materials in many cases. In many other cases, it just doesn't actually have an actual effect, mainly because as soon as you put a plant out from a situation where they might have been sterile, like in a greenhouse where they sterilize soil, as soon as you put it out, within weeks, they're mycorrhizal because those spores are everywhere. It's something to remember. Remember when I said there were 13 trillion spores of Calvacia gigantea in that giant puffball? Always keep in mind that you're inhaling fungi right now in your living room. So the fungi are everywhere, and mycorrhizal fungi establish themselves very well. Now you might say, well, maybe we can figure out some mycorrhizal fungi that are just super mycorrhizal fungi. And that would be a great idea. It's a wonderful concept. It's a neat idea. It's a good story. It's just that we can't make it work. So sometimes we do what I consider to be chicken soup for the soil. We act like these products are going to be magical things that are going to make plants grow more naturally. It's just the fact is, we don't know that it does. All right, so all these different types of mycorrhizae. Oh, do we want a poem? I guess we could do a poem, or I guess we're getting close. Tell me, Ariana, where I'm at here. It says to me.
I would say we could probably do about 20 minutes of questions. So you got about 7 minutes.
Okay, with 7 minutes. So I'll do my poem. So, and I want the poem just because it kind of reminds us of how fascinating nature is. So there's a fungus that gets on your turf grass called Rhizoctonia solani. It causes brown rot of turf grass. Not brown rot, Rhizoctonia blight, we'll call it. And there is, you get, red stems that are reddened that cause you problems on your bedding plants from Rhizoctonia causing disease on your young herbaceous plants. But there's another Rhizoctonia that is very important in reproduction of orchids. And you kind of have to learn some of this if you become an orchid fancier in terms of where you get your soil and what you're doing. So Rhizoctonia turns out to be a very essential thing in reproduction in many species of orchids. Essential. It's a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, except sometimes it gets out of hand. Like I said, there's this whole spectrum of different kinds of relationships that occur. And so it tells the story of what usually happens with Rhizoctonia later on in the game. So I passed through the woodland and marked with one eye, the orchid and fungi were sharing a pie. The orchid had gravy and pie crust and meat. The fungi took the dish as their share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, fungi as a boon were kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, whilst the orchid seized knife and fork with a cry and ended the banquet by eating fungi. So this wonderful mutualistic symbiotic relationship in the end turns into the plant killing off the fungus. So, the world is an interesting place. Okay, our beech blight aphid poop eater, you look at that and you say, well, this is a Johnson Woods Nature Preserve, Northeast Ohio. You say, look, what is all this slickness here? It's not just moisture from rain. All these beech leaves have fallen to the ground and some other kind of leaves, some maples and stuff here. And then you see this Laura Chatfield, my wife, she's actually can almost skate on the boardwalk. What in heaven's name is all this stuff? It's honeydew. So what all this is the sap that's been sucked from the leaves of American beeches and then falls to the ground or falls to the boardwalk, and it's slippery. And then eventually it's going to be covered by this aphid poop eater fungus. So here's the aphids. And they, I should have a video, but they'll, if you come at them, they'll all gyrate in less, and then eventually the fungus will actually look black and then eventually tan in color. So the fungus is living on the aphid poop eater fungus. This picture's here from tomvolkfungi.net. And so it's just this fantastic situation. The fungus isn't even parasitizing the plant. It's just living on the the poop from the aphids, which are from the sap from the plants. So the beech blight aphid, the Grylocephalus imbricator, and there they are. You can kind of sense their little boogie woogie dance. And then the fungus, the beech blight sooty mold fungus, Scorius. I say Scolius here. I got carried away with the idea of scoliosis, but it's Scorius spongiosa, growing on the honeydew. So just kind of an interesting array of different things that are occurring. Now notice you can actually then also see that sooty, the sooty fungus growing on the soil. You can see it on the boardwalk. You can see it on other plants. Here it is on poison ivy, but all that has happened here is the honeydew fell from where it had been excreted by the aphids that got it from the plant, and it fell to the poison ivy that's on the ground, and then a sooty fungus is growing on that occurring. But look at it, look how beautiful really some of these strands of the aphids are. It's really kind of a fascinating story. And I always do this because we do a lot of diagnostics. You know, it's not the same thing at all as the woolly beech aphid. This is a completely different aphid. And this doesn't really occur on our American beech. It occurs on our horticultural beeches, which are basically all European and Asian beeches. And it's just a completely different thing. This is a different insect. Then there's woolly alder aphids. I'll bet you've seen woolly alder aphids. And so they do a thing that's very similar in this. They'll excrete the honeydew after they've sucked the sap from the plants, and then you'll get a sooty fungus growing, woolly alder aphids. And then diagnostically, we always do this, is what is this? You know, people say powdery mildew, they think it's one of these aphids, and it's just none of those. It's on the bottom and the top. It's gone along here with the elm black spot, but it's just, this is seed from an area where they were seeding turf grass, and they have this flocculent material. So this doesn't have anything to do with any of these other things I talked about, but it's what confuses us diagnostically. But the wild, wonderful woodlands, and you've seen this, I'll bet, and that's the old encrusted Scorius spongiosa fungus that was living on, apparently where what happens is that the honeydew kind of gets concentrated in the crotch of a twig, or maybe it's where a leaf has remained attached, a marcescent leaf has remained attached. It can be quite beautiful in the winter, etc. All right, dryad saddle. This could be one of my last ones. I'll probably skip the apple scab. Maybe I'll do the ode to rot, and maybe just a last minute flash of a whole bunch of things. But I love this example of dryad saddle, Polypora squamosa. So this is has polypores on the undersurface, like we saw with those hexagonal polypores and all those kind of things. It doesn't have gills, but this really was 19.5 inches across. It was a silver maple in the backyard of a house in Oberlin, Ohio. And you can see the pores. It's called dryad saddle because the idea in the Greek myth was that the dryads were nymphs that were sitting up here in their little saddle, and they were looking down in the forest and kind of, you know, taking care of all the creatures. So they called it dryad's saddle, kind of a nice name. Also called pheasant's back polypore, another name, you can see why. There's some examples of it. It can look a little bit like this sometimes. You're going to see this all over the place. It has a little bit different looks. Look how beautiful it can look. Really nice, big, sturdy stipes here. Beautiful fungus. Now, here we were at this location in Oberlin, Ohio, and you see they made a pruning cut, not a perfect pruning cut, but what has happened here, and there's something to keep in mind. This fungus has probably been living inside this silver maple for 10 to 15 years before it even started to show any fruiting bodies. So the decay, because this is a pathogen and a saprophyte, so it lived, so it was ramifying in here, causing decay inside the plant actively. But you know, after a certain period of time, which can be quite long, it eventually produces fruiting bodies. It's so two strains come together, you produce a fruiting body. And so then there's the dryad saddle that are out there. So there it is, the dryad saddle, 18.5 inches across. There it was. And there was a swing set over here. So eventually they did cut this down because it's a hazard tree. It's really a hazard tree. Once you saw that, this was a good sign with this particular fungus, at least, not all, but this particular fungus was such a good pathogen. This is actively causing more and more decay. So it's become a hazard. So in 2011, it looked like that. Here it is in 2012. But here it started to do this. So was it just decaying? What is actually happening here? What was actually occurring? And then the next time we came back, look at what we saw, a little wildlife. So either these guys were eating that fungus and emerging, or it eventually decayed completely. And that was just a nice little hole for them in this place where the Dryad saddle had been. All right, we'll skip our app. I do want you to come to Sequest Arboretum. Please come visit us and come look at our crab apples any time of the year, but especially in spring, and a little story of plant diseases. But I need to do this. This is how fungi infect leaves. So here's the story. A fungal spore lands on the surface of the plant's leaf. Now it's not this big, and this is just a representation of the cuticle, the upper layer of epidermal cells. And then in here is where you have the parenchyma, and you have photosynthesis occurring here. And this is the vascular strand that is taking the food produced in the leaves and taking it down to the roots, and it's bringing the water up. So that's the vascular system of the xylem and phloem and cambium, and then the up lower, and you have the gas exchange and photosynthesis and all that sort of stuff. So this is how things happen. So this, if the conditions are right, that fungal spore will germinate, the right conditions of moisture and temperature. And then if other things are right and it doesn't have something that the plant is able to do to stop it, it'll penetrate the plant. And if, again, the plant can't respond in some way genetically by producing chemicals, it's eventually going to ramify through that. And in this case, it causes rose black spot. So that's how fungal. So when we use fungicides, I mean, the best way to prevent disease is to get resistant varieties of a particular plant. But if we have a situation, and a nurture situation, we're a nurseryman or we're a grower, and we use fungicides, you know, what you do is you're not going to get rid of this stuff in here. First of all, you're not going to get rid of it once you get to here, not even here, or not even here. You have to have something that is applied that stops that spore when it lands. It lands, there's something toxic, keeps it from getting there. All right, so with that in mind, let's go to John Updike, the late John Updike, always these wonderful poems. But listen to this poem. Let rot proclaim its revolution. The microscopic hyphae sink their fangs of enzyme into the rosy peach and turn its blush a yielding brown, a mud of melting glucose. Once staunch committees of chemicals now vote to join the invading union, the former monarch and constitution routed by the riot of rhizoids, the thalloid consensus. So what a wonderful, the ode to rot. All right, so we're going to skip cedar rust because we talked about it before, and then we're just going to run through this really quickly. There's morels, the wonderful morels of the springtime. There's false morels, which are somewhat poisonous and problematical. There's the smooth patch disease that you've seen on wood. Not a big problem, but you say, you know, why are this two-tone nature? It is a fungus that's there, Alurodiscus oxyi. There's witch's butter, the witch's butters, and some of these we'll talk about later are even slime molds, but tremella. You know, all these fantastic things. Look at the orange jelly, the rounded earth stars that are pushing themselves up out of the ground, little eyeballs, the Calvacia gigantea, that puffball that we saw earlier. You know, but you know, if you're going to ever eat these, and you want to make sure it is the right species, but if you're going to eat them, you want to do it before they get like this. These are not good eating once they get to that point. And the shaggy mane, Caprinus, really an interesting and beautiful fungus, although ultimately it's going to have some ugly aspects to it. You know, look at the shaggy mane and the kind of different images. Look at how different it looks, and then that inky component of it as it decays. All these different looks to the shaggy mane. The walnut mycena, this is where you're going to impress somebody because it's attached to those little walnuts that are buried in the soil underneath a walnut tree. Really beautiful little parasolish like mushroom. And there it is, the walnut mycena, beautiful mushroom. The pinwheel marasmius. Here we were out in Geneva Hills down in near Lancaster with the pinwheel marasmius on one of our trips. You know, these nice little stalks, the little tiny parasol caps and the nice little black stalks. And one of the women there found this big giant mat of these things. It was right after a rain. So we decided to call it fungi shui instead of feng shui. The boletes, which have pores, which are really these stout mushrooms that are really quite spectacular and really bold looking. This is my favorite mushroom. It's almost everywhere. It's a saprophyte. Look at that little violet ring. It's somewhat subtle, sometimes not as subtle, but the violet toothed polypore, look at that. I mean, you're gonna see this on dead logs just anywhere. And it is just a wonderful little thing, lovely. And you know, remember, is it edible or poisonous? There's all these falsehoods. Poisonous mushrooms tarnish silver spoons, false. If it peels, you can eat it, false. Mushrooms that squirrels or other animals eat are safe for humans, false. You know, you really have to know a lot of detail. So you want to get a lot of good mushroom books. The Audubon Society book is a pretty good book. There are much more specialized kinds of things that you can get. Really a lot of things. We have a small one at Ohio State, Mushrooms and Macrofungi of Ohio and Midwestern States. It really is a fun thing. But remember, in Nature's Infinite Book of Secrecy, a little I can read. So we talked a little bit about the little that you can get with fungi. So finally, what 4 organisms are present? There's a lichen and a cyanobacterium. You know, there you're seeing a tree. There you're seeing plum black knot. You're seeing a fungus. So a fungus, a lichen with its 2 organisms, probably a second lichen that's over here. I don't see any mosses on here, but there probably were somewhere on the plant, and the tree itself. So all these different kind of things. Remember not to be stubborn.
Lovely. Was that the end?
Yeah, that's the end.
That was such a fast ending. I expected some beautiful poem or
No, I realize it's already 8:20, so I need to recognize it. Probably pushed you to near your limit already with the debate coming up at 9.
Well, does anyone have any questions they would like to put in the chat for Jim? I don't know if you guys can. For me, it's at the bottom. For some of you, it may be at the top.
All right.
That was really good, though. I liked that you added your, thank you, Mary. I liked that you added your favorite fungi. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, you know, I really do. It's just that little rim of violet. And, you know, violet is sometimes hard to come by in the woods. And so I really do like that particular thing.
Yeah. All right, let me see if I saw it.
You know, while people are gearing up on potentially some questions, I would just like to, so the tripartite symbiosis is something that may interest you. I suspect that most of you know about Indian pipe. So Indian pipe is a plant in the genus Monarda. And Indian pipe is a plant that is oftentimes considered to be a parasitic plant. And it's actually a little different than we think. So basically the idea is that the Indian pipe links up to trees in the woodlands. I mean, the flower and the stem of the plant are a ghostly white, the Indian pipe, ghostly looking white. Doesn't seem like there's any chlorophyll present. It turns out that there is a tiny bit of, there are certainly chloroplasts present, so the structures that should have chlorophyll. And there's a tiny bit of chlorophyll in there, but it's clear that they don't get much of their nutrition from photosynthesis. So that's why, but they're clearly also plants. I mean, they have flowers, so they're flowering plants. They're considered the higher plants, but they don't produce their own food or hardly any of their food. So the idea was, okay, so they're getting it from the roots of plants. So it's a parasite on plants. That's what we would define it as. It would be a symbiosis, which is certainly not a mutualistic symbiosis. Well, it turns out that isn't the case. I mean, I used to say this all the time to people.
Jim, it looks like you got a question if you want to answer it.
Okay, I'll finish this really quick. It turns out that it's a tripartite symbiosis. It turns out that actually what is happening is that the fungus, or that the plant, the Indian pipe flower and plant, is getting its actual carbon nutrition, its carbohydrates, its energy source from the mycorrhizal fungus that is an intermediate between the Indian pipe plant and the, let's say, oak tree. So the oak tree is photosynthesizing, it's producing carbohydrate. The fungus is getting its carbohydrate from the oak tree, and then the Indian pipe plant is getting its carbohydrate actually from the mycorrhizal fungus. So it's actually a 3-part symbiosis. Okay, so now on, so it's just something that always the increasing fun of nature and learning more stuff. All right, the question is, let's see.
So it's Lynette. They said, how would you suggest starting to learn mushrooms, and what would you suggest for a field guide for novices?
All right, so I would get the Audubon field guide. I think that's a pretty good field guide. So it'll have a lot of good pictures, number one. So that would be a field guide that I would get. There are a couple of little beginner field guides, I think, in the Peterson Field Guide series as well. But I really think that the best way to do it is the way, I mean, I knew fungi from being a plant pathologist, but I knew fungi mostly relative to plant diseases. Obviously, I was aware of certain mushrooms that are involved as pathogens. And so I knew a little bit about fleshy woodland fungi, but hardly, not much at all. So when I had to teach fleshy woodland fungi, I was more or less in the same situation as all of you. You know, I had interest in natural things. I had I had a lot of interest in plant pathogenic fungi, but woodland fungi and mushrooms, not so much. So the Audubon Field Guide, I thought, was a good starter. It's one of many, but it's a good starter. Secondly, I would join up a group like OHMS. So I would meditate in OHMS. I would get with the Ohio Mushroom Society or the Indiana Mushroom Society and go out on forays. Now, one of the things I have to tell you that can be frustrating, my wife went with me on the forays, and she already has enough problems with me stopping and taking pictures of diseases and trees and everything else. And so, and she wants to hike. She just wants to move along. So the reality of it is, if you go out on a foray with a bunch of mushroom lovers, you may find yourself 2 hours in having gone 150 feet because they see so many things that you never saw in your life. You know, you think, oh boy, there's not much out there. And they are getting off the trail and they are looking under logs. They're finding things. I mean, that's where you're going to find the eyelash fungus. They're going to see so many things that you don't see. So you don't tend to move rapidly. So you may have to, if you're really into the hiking part, take a hike as a separate aspect, but learn from people that do this all the time. They're going to give you tips on at least what works for them. They almost always have a big meal, which has all kinds of mushrooms that you can eat. People use the chicken of the woods mushroom and make all kinds of dishes. They kind of use them as chicken fingers, the chicken of the woods fungus. If it's at the right texture and age, you use those as your chicken fingers, saute them in garlic and all that kind of, and herbs and all that kind of stuff. And then, put it with some pasta and it's fantastic. There really are, so I would join a society and there's ones in every state, and go out on some of these forays and get out in the woods. But then also just, the web is a great source as well. I mean, look at these, take a picture, you can use all these websites where you have a picture and compare to what somebody says it is. Recognize that it's always going to be a learning curve like it is with birds. I mean, birds are, male and female birds, and you're going to have birds that look different at different stages of their development and all that sort of stuff. So fungi can be confusing because they look different when they first come up out of the ground until they start decaying. But really get into going around with other people that do it is probably the most important thing. And then have a field guide to go along with it.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys have used this, but I also have used the iNaturalist app, and several people in this organization use the Seek app as well. So, and I'm sure, I don't know, Jim, maybe you could answer some of their questions. You can go out and look at fun fungi with them.
Oh yeah.
Well, great. I'm going to say there's no more questions, so we'll probably go ahead and stop it. Just thank you so much for coming. And Jim, thank you so much for talking. That was wonderful. You had lots of lovely pictures. It was really wonderful.
Yeah, quite a joy. Thank you.
But don't forget, if you guys want to learn more about Western Wildlife Corridor, please go to our website. Also, if you're interested in becoming a member, you can reach out to us, or you can also become a member online. And as a side note, this event was recorded. I will be getting it up, but it might take a couple days. Sometimes there's a processing error, sometimes not, so it might take a minute. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you again. And Jim,
thanks.
Have a good night.
You too. Thank everybody.